My parents beat me in childhood. They demanded a share of my company because I escaped from them. When I refused, my mother attacked me with the intent to. I don't know why I'm writing this, but I guess I just need to get it out. Maybe someone out there has gone through something similar. Maybe I'm just screaming into the void. Either way, here it goes. I grew up in a small, suffocating town where everyone knew everyone, but nobody really knew anything about me. I was just that weird, quiet kid, the one people liked to pick on because I didn't fit in. From the very beginning, I was an outsider. It wasn't like I was born with some glaring difference. I was just shy, awkward, and didn't know how to make friends. My parents weren't exactly the kind who nurtured social skills. They were too busy with their own problems, which I'll get to later. School was hell from day one. The first day of kindergarten, I remember standing on the playground, watching the other kids play together. I was too scared to join in, too afraid of rejection. I didn't even know how to ask if I could play with them. Instead, I just stood there, a little shadow in the background, hoping someone would notice me, but they never did. It was a pattern that would follow me through my entire childhood. In elementary school, the bullying started. Kids can be cruel, and I seemed to be an easy target. My classmates would taunt me, call me names, and laugh at my expense. I was the skinny, awkward kid with glasses too big for his face, clothes that never fit right, and a mop of hair that always looked unkempt no matter how much I tried to tame it. My parents didn't care about how I looked. They were too wrapped up in their own worlds of misery. The bullying wasn't just verbal. It was physical too. They'd shove me into lockers, trip me in the hallways, and sometimes just beat me up for fun. I remember once, in 5th grade, a group of boys cornered me in the bathroom and held my head in the toilet, laughing as I choked on the filthy water. When they finally let me go, I ran to the nurse's office, soaked and humiliated. The nurse didn't ask questions, just gave me a towel and sent me back to class. Nobody cared. The teachers turned a blind eye, or maybe they just didn't want to deal with it. I was the kid everyone could ignore. Home was supposed to be my sanctuary, but it was anything but. My parents were a nightmare. My dad was a drunk, plain and simple. He was the kind of man who'd spend all day at work, come home, and immediately crack open a beer. Then another, and another. By the time dinner rolled around, he'd be 3 sheets to the wind, slurring his words and stinking of alcohol. He was a mean drunk too, the kind who'd get angry over the smallest things. If dinner wasn't ready on time, or if something wasn't to his liking, he'd explode in a fit of rage. Plates would be thrown, food would go flying, and my mom would just sit there, taking it, or worse, drinking right alongside him. My mom wasn't any better. She was an alcoholic too, but she had her own special brand of cruelty. She'd belittle me, tell me I was worthless, that I'd never amount to anything. "You're just like your father," she'd sneer, as if that was the worst insult she could think of. And maybe it was, because deep down, I was terrified that she was right. I didn't want to be like him, but with every passing day, I felt myself slipping further and further into despair. They didn't just hurt each other, they hurt me too. I remember one night, I couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. I spilled a glass of milk at dinner. My dad flew into a rage, yanked me out of my chair, and threw me across the room. I hit the wall so hard I saw stars, and when I came to, my mom was standing over me, telling me to stop being so clumsy, to stop making my father angry, as if it was my fault. This was my life, a constant cycle of fear and pain, both at school and at home. I tried to escape into books, into video games, into anything that could take me away from the hell I was living in. But nothing could really take the edge off. The loneliness was the worst part. I had no friends, nobody to confide in, nobody who cared. I was completely and utterly alone. As I got older, things didn't get any better. High school was just a continuation of the torment, but now it was mixed with the added pressure of trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with my life. The guidance counselor would call me in, talk to me about my grades, mediocre at best, and ask me what I wanted to do after graduation. I had no idea. How could I think about the future when I was just trying to survive the present? The bullying intensified in high school. The pranks became more elaborate, more humiliating. Once, they taped me to a flagpole in the middle of winter. I stood there for hours, shivering, crying, while everyone else walked by, laughing, taking pictures. Nobody helped me. When a teacher finally found me, she just sighed, cut me loose, and told me to go to the nurse. I didn't bother. I just walked home, numb with cold and shame. At home, things were falling apart even more. My parents' drinking got worse, and the fights became more violent. I spent as much time out of the house as I could, but I had nowhere to go. I'd just wander the streets, trying to stay away until I was sure they'd be passed out. But sometimes, I'd come home too early, and I'd get caught in the crossfire. I lost count of how many times I ended up with bruises, cuts, or worse. The one thing that kept me going was the thought of getting out, of leaving that town and never looking back. College seemed like the only way out, the only chance I had to escape. I threw myself into my studies, trying to get good enough grades to get into a decent university. It was hard. I wasn't a naturally gifted student, and the stress of my home life made it even harder to focus. But I worked my ass off, staying up late into the night, doing extra credit assignments, anything to boost my GPA. Somehow, by some miracle, I managed to get accepted into a state university. It wasn't anything prestigious, but it was far enough away from home that I could finally get away from my parents, from the town that had been my prison for so long. The day I got my acceptance letter was the first time I'd felt a glimmer of hope in years. But even that wasn't enough to save me. College was supposed to be a fresh start, but it turned out to be just another nightmare. I didn't know how to make friends, how to fit in. Everyone else seemed so confident, so sure of themselves, and there I was, still the awkward, scared kid I'd always been. I couldn't connect with anyone, couldn't find my place. The loneliness I thought I'd left behind followed me to campus like a shadow. My classes were harder than I'd expected too. I struggled to keep up, and my grades started to slip. I didn't know how to ask for help. I'd spent my whole life being told I was stupid, worthless, so how could I admit that I was failing? I started skipping classes, spending more and more time alone in my dorm room, just trying to hide from the world. My depression deepened. I'd lie in bed for hours, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at the ceiling and wonder why I even bothered to get out of bed in the morning. The thought of going to class, of being around other people, filled me with anxiety. I started drinking, just like my parents, trying to numb the pain. It worked for a little while, but then the alcohol would wear off, and I'd feel even worse than before. It wasn't long before I dropped out. I couldn't handle it anymore. The stress, the loneliness, the feeling of failure. It all became too much. I packed up my things in the middle of the night and left campus without telling anyone. I didn't even go back home. I just got on a bus and kept going until I ended up in a city where nobody knew me, where I could disappear. The city was supposed to be my salvation, but it turned out to be just another kind of prison. I had no money, no job, no prospects. I lived in a cheap, run-down apartment, surrounded by people just as broken as I was. I found work at a greasy diner, working long hours for minimum wage, just trying to survive. I'd come home to my empty apartment, drink myself into oblivion, and pass out on the couch, only to wake up and do it all over again the next day. I was completely and utterly lost. The dreams I'd once had of escaping, of building a better life for myself, had crumbled into dust. I was just existing, going through the motions, waiting for something, anything, to change. But nothing ever did. That was my life for years. Just a cycle of work, drinking, and trying to forget. I had no friends, no family, nothing. My parents didn't care where I was, didn't bother to look for me. And why would they? I was just a reminder of their own failures, their own misery. I was nobody, to them and to myself. I don't know what kept me going. Maybe it was just stubbornness, or maybe it was the small, flickering hope that someday, somehow, things might get better. But deep down, I knew that hope was a lie. I was stuck, trapped in a life I never wanted, a life I couldn't escape. After years of living in a fog, something finally snapped inside me. I don't know what triggered it. Maybe it was the endless monotony of my life, or maybe it was just the realization that if I didn't do something, I would drink myself into an early grave like my parents. Whatever it was, I woke up one morning, head pounding from the usual hangover, and decided that I couldn't keep going like this. I had to change, or I wouldn't survive. It wasn't easy. Change never is. I started small, setting myself little goals. First, I cut back on the drinking. Not quitting entirely, I wasn't ready for that, but cutting down to just a couple of beers a night instead of a full bottle of whiskey. It was harder than I expected. The urge to numb myself was always there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but I forced myself to resist, one day at a time. Then, I started looking for a better job. The diner was killing me, not just because of the long hours and low pay, but because it was a constant reminder of how far I'd fallen. I needed something different, something that would give me a sense of purpose. I spent hours online, combing through job boards, sending out resumes, and going to interviews. Most of the time, I didn't even get a response. When I did, the interviews were usually awkward and ended with a polite rejection. My confidence was at an all-time low, but I kept pushing, kept trying. And then, finally, something clicked. I got an interview at a small tech company. They weren't looking for anything fancy, just someone to handle customer service and basic administrative tasks. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't pay much more than the diner, but it was a start. The office was in a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place you drive past without even noticing. But inside, it was warm, welcoming, and filled with people who seemed genuinely happy to be there. The interview went better than I'd expected. The manager, a woman named Linda, was kind, with a no-nonsense attitude that I found oddly comforting. She didn't grill me on my past, didn't ask uncomfortable questions about why I'd been working at a diner for the past few years. She just asked if I was willing to learn, if I was ready to work hard. I told her I was, and for the first time in a long time, I actually meant it. A few days later, I got the call. The job was mine. It wasn't much, but it felt like a lifeline. I threw myself into the work, determined to prove that I could be more than just a screw-up. The tasks were simple at first, answering phones, responding to emails, filing paperwork, but I approached them with a seriousness that surprised even me. The days were long, but they gave me something I hadn't had in years, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And then, something unexpected happened. I made a friend. His name was Matt. He was one of the tech guys at the company, a bit older than me, with a laid-back attitude and a sense of humor that put everyone at ease. He wasn't like the people I'd known before. He didn't judge me for my past, didn't treat me like I was damaged goods. He was just friendly. And for someone like me, who had spent so much time alone, that meant the world. Matt and I started hanging out after work. At first, it was just grabbing a beer at the bar down the street, but soon we were spending more time together, talking about everything and nothing. He had this way of making me feel like I was worth something, like my life wasn't just a series of mistakes and failures. For the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could turn things around. It was Matt who convinced me to join a gym. I laughed when he first suggested it, picturing myself struggling to lift weights while surrounded by people who looked like they belonged on the cover of a fitness magazine. But Matt was persistent. "It's not about looking good," he said one night as we sat in his tiny apartment, eating takeout. "It's about feeling good. Trust me, man. It'll help." I wasn't sure, but I didn't have anything to lose. So I went. The first few weeks were torture. I was out of shape, weak, and embarrassed by how little I could do. But Matt was always there, encouraging me, pushing me just enough to keep me going without making me feel like a failure. Slowly, I started to improve. I could lift a little more, run a little longer. The changes were small, but they were there, and with each bit of progress, I felt a little bit stronger, a little more in control of my life. Working out became my new addiction, but this one was healthy. It gave me a sense of accomplishment, a way to channel all the anger, the frustration, the pain that had been building up inside me for so long. I started eating better, sleeping better, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually living instead of just existing. As my physical health improved, so did my mental health. The fog of depression that had hung over me for so long began to lift, replaced by a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I was still haunted by my past, but it didn't control me anymore. I was starting to see that I had the power to shape my future, to make something of myself. At work, things were getting better too. I started taking on more responsibilities, learning new skills, and getting to know my coworkers. Linda, my manager, noticed my efforts, and began giving me more challenging tasks. I learned how to manage projects, work with clients, and even dip my toes into some of the tech side of things. It was exciting, and for the first time in a long time, I actually felt proud of myself. Matt and I began talking about the future, about what we wanted to do with our lives. He had dreams of starting his own business, of creating something that was his, something that mattered. I admired his ambition, but I didn't see myself as that kind of person. I was still struggling to believe that I even had a future, let alone one where I could be successful. But Matt didn't give up on me. He saw potential in me that I couldn't see in myself. "You're smart, man," he'd say. "You just need to believe it. We could do this together, you know? Build something from the ground up. Make a real difference." It sounded crazy, but the more we talked about it, the more the idea started to take root in my mind. I started thinking about what I could do, what I could contribute. I wasn't tech-savvy like Matt, but I was good with people, good at organizing things, at seeing the big picture. Maybe, just maybe, I could be more than just a cog in someone else's machine. We spent months planning, researching, and saving up every penny we could. We'd meet up after work, poring over business plans, market research, and financial projections. It was hard work, but it was exhilarating. For the first time, I was working towards something that was mine, something that I could be proud of. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we were ready. We quit our jobs, pooled our savings, and rented a small office space in a rundown building in the heart of the city. It wasn't much, just a couple of desks, some secondhand computers, and a lot of determination, but it was ours. We named the company NextGen Solutions, a nod to our belief that we could bring something new, something innovative, to the market. The early days were rough. We had no clients, no reputation, and very little money. We worked long hours, often sleeping in the office because we couldn't afford to waste time commuting. Every day was a struggle, a constant battle against self-doubt and the fear of failure. But we kept going, kept pushing, because we believed in what we were doing. Our first break came when we landed a small contract with a local business. It wasn't much, just a few $1,000s to build a website and manage their social media, but it was a start. We threw ourselves into the project, working day and night to make sure it was perfect. When we delivered, the client was thrilled. They recommended us to others, and slowly, word began to spread. Business started to pick up. We took on more clients, expanded our services, and hired a couple of freelancers to help with the workload. The money was still tight, but we were growing, and that was all that mattered. Each success, no matter how small, felt like a victory, a step closer to the future we dreamed of. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. We hit plenty of bumps along the way. There were times when we didn't know if we'd make it, when the stress and pressure seemed too much to bear. We had a few clients who didn't pay, leaving us scrambling to cover our expenses. We made mistakes, plenty of them, and had to learn some hard lessons along the way. One of the toughest challenges came from a competitor, a well-established company that saw us as a threat. They started undercutting our prices, spreading rumors about our business, and even tried to poach our clients. It was a brutal wake-up call, a reminder that the world of business could be just as cutthroat as any other part of life. But instead of backing down, we fought back. We doubled down on our efforts, improving our services, building stronger relationships with our clients, and proving that we could deliver better results than anyone else. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I wanted to throw in the towel, but Matt kept me going. He believed in what we were doing, and his belief gave me the strength to keep fighting. Eventually, our hard work paid off. The competitor backed off, unable to keep up with our pace, and we emerged stronger than ever. Our client base grew, and so did our reputation. We started making real money, more than I ever thought possible. $5,000 a month turned into 10, then 15. We moved into a bigger office, hired more staff, and started thinking about the future. It was around this time that I began to realize something important. All the money, all the success, it didn't mean anything if I didn't have inner peace, if I didn't feel good about who I was and what I was doing. The old demons from my past still haunted me, still whispered in my ear that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't deserve any of this. But I didn't want to be that person anymore. I didn't want to be the scared, lonely kid who had been beaten down by life. I wanted to be someone who could be proud of himself, Someone who could look in the mirror and see a man who had overcome the odds, who had built something out of nothing. So I started working on myself, really working on myself. I went back to therapy, something I'd avoided for years because I didn't want to confront my past. It was hard, painful work, digging up all those old memories, all that pain I'd buried deep inside. But it was worth it. With the help of my therapist, I began to understand where my fears came from, why I had so much anger and resentment bottled up inside me. I began to forgive myself, to let go of the guilt and shame that had been weighing me down for so long. I started practicing mindfulness, learning to be present in the moment, to appreciate the good things in my life instead of always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I made peace with the fact that my past didn't define me, that I could choose to be the person I wanted to be. And slowly, I began to heal. Matt was there for me every step of the way. He was more than just a business partner. He was the brother I'd never had, the friend I'd always needed. He understood me in a way that nobody else ever had, and he never judged me for my struggles. He just supported me, encouraged me, and reminded me that I wasn't alone. As our business continued to grow, so did our friendship. We celebrated our successes together, weathered the storms together, and dreamed about the future together. We talked about expanding the business, opening new offices in other cities, maybe even going global one day. The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time in my life, I was excited about the future. But more than that, I was content. I had found a sense of peace, a sense of purpose that I had never known before. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I had built something with my own hands, something that mattered, something that I could be proud of. And in the process, I had found myself. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, still be moments of doubt and fear. But I also knew that I had the strength to face them, that I had the support of a friend who believed in me, and that I had the resilience to keep going no matter what. As I sit here writing this, looking back on everything I've been through, I can hardly believe how far I've come. The scared, lonely kid who was bullied in school, who grew up in a house filled with anger and pain, who ran away from his past and tried to drown his sorrows in alcohol, that kid is still a part of me, but he doesn't define me anymore. I'm more than that now. I'm stronger, wiser, and finally, after all these years, at peace with who I am. And that, more than anything else, is what I'm most proud of. So if you're reading this, if you've been through something similar, if you're struggling with your own demons, just know that it's possible to change. It's possible to heal. It's possible to build a life that you can be proud of, no matter where you come from or what you've been through. Life was finally good, or so I thought. Matt and I had built our company from the ground up, and it was thriving beyond our wildest dreams. We had more clients than we could handle, a steady stream of income, and a sense of fulfillment that neither of us had ever known before. I was in a good place mentally and physically, thanks to Matt's unwavering support and the therapy that had helped me confront my past. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control, like I had finally broken free from the chains of my past. But life has a way of reminding you that the past is never truly gone. It can resurface when you least expect it, in ways you never imagined. It was a Thursday morning, and I was in the office early, as usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light through the windows, and I was sitting at my desk, sipping my coffee and going over the week's reports. Matt hadn't arrived yet, but that was normal. He was more of a night owl, often staying late to work on projects while I preferred to get an early start. I was lost in thought when my phone buzzed, jolting me out of my concentration. It was an unknown number, but something told me to answer it. "Hello?" I said, half expecting it to be a spam call. Is this Jacob Winters?" A voice on the other end stammered, sounding nervous and unsure. "Yes, who's this?" I replied, puzzled by the hesitation. It's Dad," the voice said, and my blood ran cold. I hadn't heard that voice in years, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. But it was him, no doubt about it. My father. The last time I had seen him, he was a broken man, lost in a haze of alcohol and anger. I had spent so long trying to forget that part of my life, trying to bury it deep inside, but hearing his voice brought it all rushing back. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my hands trembling. We need to talk, Jacob. Your mother and I, we need to see you, he said, and there was something in his voice that made me uneasy. It wasn't the anger I had expected. It was desperation. About what? I asked, not really wanting to hear the answer. Just come to the house. Please. We'll explain everything, he said, and then, without waiting for a response, he hung up. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My parents had never tried to contact me after I left. They hadn't cared where I was, what I was doing, or if I was even alive. And now, out of the blue, they wanted to talk? Part of me wanted to ignore the call, to pretend it had never happened and go on with my life. But another part of me, a small, curious part, wanted to know why they were reaching out now, after all these years. Maybe they had changed. Maybe they wanted to make amends. But deep down, I knew better. People like them didn't change. They just found new ways to manipulate, to hurt. When Matt arrived at the office, I told him about the call. He listened quietly, his face thoughtful as I spoke. "So, what are you going to do?" he asked when I finished. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't trust them, Matt, but I feel like I need to know what they want." He nodded. "I get that, but whatever you decide, just know I'm here for you. You don't have to face this alone." His words were comforting, but they didn't make the decision any easier. After a lot of thinking, I decided to go. I didn't want to, but I knew that if I didn't, the questions would eat away at me. The next day, I took a deep breath and drove back to the town I had sworn I'd never return to. The drive felt surreal, like I was slipping back into a nightmare I had only just escaped. The town hadn't changed much, the same rundown houses, the same dreary streets. But I had changed, and that gave me a small sense of comfort. When I pulled up in front of my parents' house, I felt a wave of nausea. The house looked even worse than I remembered. Paint peeling, windows dirty, the lawn overgrown with weeds. It was a physical manifestation of the neglect and decay that had marked my childhood. I walked up to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest, and knocked. The door creaked open, and there stood my father. He looked older, more worn down, but still the same man I remembered. His face lined with anger, his eyes cold and calculating. "Jacob," he said, his voice flat. "Come in." I stepped inside, the familiar smell of stale cigarettes and alcohol hitting me like a punch to the gut. My mother was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV with a glazed expression. She didn't even look up when I entered. "Mom," I said, trying to catch her attention, but she just muttered something under her breath and took another swig from the bottle in her hand. "Let's get this over with," my father said, leading me into the kitchen. The room was cluttered, dishes piled up in the sink, the table covered with old newspapers and empty cans. He gestured for me to sit down, and I did, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "So, what do you want?" I asked, cutting to the chase. My father didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to gauge my reaction. "We heard about your business," he finally said, his voice laced with bitterness. "You and that friend of yours, making all that money." I stiffened, my suspicions confirmed. "What about it?" "You owe us, Jacob," he said, his tone turning accusatory. "After everything we did for you, raising you, giving you a roof over your head, and then you just ran away. We deserve our share." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're kidding, right? You think you deserve a share of the business Matt and I built from nothing? After everything you put me through? You ungrateful little shit," he spat, slamming his fist on the table. "We raised you. We fed you. You wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for us." "Raised me? You call that raising?" I snapped, my anger boiling over. "You were drunk half the time, and the other half you were beating the crap out of me. You didn't raise me. You tortured me." My mother finally looked up from the couch, her eyes bleary and unfocused. "Don't talk to your father like that," she slurred. "Don't you dare defend him." I shot back, my voice shaking with rage. "You were just as bad, if not worse. You both treated me like garbage, and now you think I owe you something? You're delusional." My father's face turned red with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might hit me. But then he just sneered. "You're going to regret this, Jacob." We won't let you get away with it. Get away with what? I shouted. Living my life? Building something for myself? You have no right to anything I've earned. None. Get out of my house, he snarled, pointing to the door. Gladly, I said, standing up. And don't ever contact me again. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, not bothering to look back. As I reached the front door, my mother called out weakly, Jacob? I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn around, to see if there was any shred of humanity left in her, any chance of reconciliation. But then I remembered everything she had done, everything she had allowed to happen, and I walked out the door without a word. I drove back to the city in a daze, my mind reeling from the encounter. I had known it would be bad, but I hadn't expected it to be that bad. The sheer audacity of their demands, their complete lack of remorse, it was almost too much to process. When I got back to the office, Matt was waiting for me. One look at my face, and he knew something was wrong. What happened? He asked, concern etched on his face. I told him everything. How my parents had demanded a share of the business, how they had tried to guilt-trip me into giving them money, how they had shown no regret for the way they had treated me. Matt listened quietly, his expression growing darker with every word. They're not going to leave you alone. You know that, right? He said when I finished. I know, I said, feeling a sense of dread settle over me. But I'm not going to let them take anything from me. Not now, not ever. Matt nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He knew, just as I did, that this wasn't over. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to focus on work, on keeping the business running, but the encounter with my parents weighed heavily on my mind. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for them to do something drastic. I just didn't know what. Then, on Sunday, it happened. It was a quiet day, one of those rare weekends when I didn't have to work, and I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The weather was nice, sunny, with a gentle breeze, and I wandered through the city, lost in thought. I didn't notice the woman following me, not at first. She kept her distance, blending in with the crowd, and I was too distracted to pay attention. I was in a park, sitting on a bench, when she finally made her move. It happened so fast that I didn't even have time to react. One moment, I was enjoying the peace and quiet, and the next, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. Everything went black for a moment, and when I came to, I was on the ground, my vision blurry, my head throbbing with pain. A bag was pulled over my head, and before I could make sense of what was happening, I felt a searing pain in my side. I gasped, trying to catch my breath, but the blows kept coming, one after another. I tried to fight back, but my attacker was relentless, swinging a heavy object with brutal force. I don't know how long it lasted. Seconds, minutes. It felt like an eternity. I was barely conscious, my body screaming in agony, when the assault finally stopped. The bag was ripped off my head, and through the haze of pain, I saw her face. It was my mother. She was standing over me, a piece of rebar clutched in her hand, her face twisted in a grotesque mask of fury. She was barely recognizable, her eyes wild, her hair disheveled, her breath reeking of alcohol. You think you can just walk away? She spat, her voice venomous. You think you can just leave us and start over? You owe us, Jacob. You owe us everything. I tried to speak, to plead with her, but the pain was too much. I could feel blood seeping from the wounds in my side, pooling beneath me on the ground. I was losing consciousness, my vision darkening, but I forced myself to hold on, to stay awake. I should have done this years ago, she snarled, raising the rebar for another blow. But before she could bring it down, someone tackled her from behind. I heard a scuffle, voices shouting, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, my body aching all over. It took me a moment to remember what had happened, to piece together the events that had led me here. The attack, my mother, the rebar. Panic seized me, and I tried to sit up, but the pain in my side flared, and I collapsed back onto the bed, gasping. Easy there, a voice said, and I turned my head to see Matt sitting in a chair beside the bed, his face pale and drawn. You're okay, Jacob. You're safe.
Matt?
I croaked, my throat dry and scratchy. What What happened? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. You were attacked in the park. Some jogger saw what was happening and called the cops. They got there just in time to stop her from doing any more damage. Her, I whispered, the memory flooding back. It was my mother, Matt. She tried to kill me. I know, he said quietly, his eyes full of sympathy. She's in custody now. They're charging her with attempted murder. I closed my eyes, trying to process it all. My own mother had tried to kill me. I had known she was capable of cruelty, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. I'm so sorry, Jacob, Matt said, his voice breaking the silence. I should have been there. I should have. Don't, I interrupted, opening my eyes to look at him. This isn't your fault, Matt. It's hers. All hers. He nodded, but I could see the guilt in his eyes, the helplessness. He had always been there for me, always protected me, but this time, there was nothing he could have done. The next few days were a blur of pain, doctors, and police officers asking questions. The injuries I had sustained were severe. Broken ribs, a concussion, deep lacerations that required stitches, but I was alive. Barely, but alive. When I was finally well enough to be discharged, Matt took me home, insisting that I stay with him until I fully recovered. I didn't argue. I didn't want to be alone. The thought of being in my apartment, isolated and vulnerable, was too much to bear. The police had gathered enough evidence to charge my mother with attempted murder. They had witnesses, the weapon, and my testimony. The trial was set to begin in a few weeks, and I was determined to see it through, to make sure she was held accountable for what she had done. The days leading up to the trial were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. The physical pain was one thing, but the emotional toll was another. I had always known that my relationship with my parents was toxic, but this was something else entirely. I felt betrayed, not just by my mother's actions, but by the twisted love I had still harbored for her, despite everything. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let myself believe, even for a moment, that they might have changed? Matt was a constant source of support, staying by my side, helping me with everything from the physical therapy I needed to regain my strength to the endless paperwork required by the legal process. I don't know how I would have survived without him. He was more than a friend. He was my rock, my anchor in the storm. When the trial finally began, I was ready. I had spent hours with my lawyer, going over my testimony, preparing myself for the questions that would be asked. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to see justice served. The courtroom was a cold, sterile place, filled with the murmurs of people I didn't know, all there to witness the spectacle of a mother on trial for attempting to kill her own son. I sat at the front, next to my lawyer, my hands clenched into fists to keep them from shaking. My mother sat across from me, looking frail and pathetic in her orange jumpsuit. Her hair was unkempt, her face gaunt, and she refused to meet my eyes. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The trial was brutal. The prosecution laid out the facts in stark detail, painting a picture of a woman driven by greed and resentment, willing to do anything, even murder her own child, to get what she wanted. They called witnesses, presented evidence, and made a compelling case. My lawyer was equally relentless, questioning my mother's motives, her history of abuse, and her actions leading up to the attack. He didn't hold back, and neither did I. When it was my turn to testify, I told the court everything about my childhood, the years of abuse, the way she and my father had tried to manipulate me into giving them money, and finally, the attack itself. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, standing there in front of a room full of strangers, reliving the worst moments of my life. But I did it, and when I was done, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had spoken the truth, and now it was up to the jury to decide. The defense tried to paint my mother as a victim of circumstance, a woman driven to desperation by her son's abandonment. They tried to argue that she hadn't intended to kill me, that it was all a terrible mistake. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through their arguments. It didn't take long for them to reach a verdict. Guilty. When the judge pronounced the sentence, 5 years in prison for attempted murder, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, anger, sadness, But most of all, closure. It was over. The woman who had caused me so much pain, who had tried to take everything from me, was finally being held accountable. As I left the courtroom, Matt by my side, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The nightmare was over, and I was free. The next few weeks were a time of healing, both physically and emotionally. I continued my therapy, working through the trauma of the attack, and slowly, I began to rebuild my life. The scars, both inside and out, would never fully fade, but I knew I was stronger now, more resilient. Matt and I threw ourselves back into the business, using work as a way to move forward, to reclaim the sense of purpose we had lost. It wasn't easy, but together, we managed to get back on track. Our clients were understanding, our employees supportive, and slowly, life began to return to normal. But it was a new normal, one where I had finally let go of the past, where I had made peace with the fact that my parents were no longer a part of my life. They had tried to drag me down with them, but they had failed. I was still standing, still moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. In the end, I realized that the attack, as horrifying as it was, had given me something I hadn't known I needed: closure. It had forced me to confront the demons of my past, to stand up to the people who had hurt me, and to finally take control of my own destiny. And as I sat in my office one evening, the sun setting behind the city skyline, I knew that I had finally won. Not just in the courtroom, but in life. I had built something good, something strong, something that no one could ever take away from me. And that, more than anything, was the victory I had been searching for all along.